Hey there, and thanks for watching. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to build an American-style real estate equity waterfall model. This is a Watch Me Build video. In the spirit of the other Watch Me Build videos, what I'll be doing is opening a fresh copy of Excel. I'll pre-populate some of the labels and formatting and such to speed the process along, but then I'll just talk through how I would build a simple American-style real estate equity waterfall model. Now, before we get into the Watch Me Build portion, let me first discuss the difference between the two types of equity waterfall models in real estate. So the first we have is the American-style waterfall. That's what we'll talk through today. And really, the main difference between an American waterfall and a European waterfall, which in a previous Watch Me Build, and I'll post to it below, I build a European-style waterfall, and so you can understand the difference between the two. But the core difference really is around how operating cash flow available for distribution during operation and cash flow available for distribution at a capital event, how those two cash flows are treated. In an American waterfall, they're generally treated separately and distinctly. So during operation, when there's cash flows available to distribute during operation, oftentimes those cash flows could be paid to the sponsor in a disproportionate manner, or a promote or a carried interest may be paid to the sponsor in an American waterfall. Whereas in a European waterfall, there needs to first be a return of capital before any promote or carried interest is paid to the sponsor. And as a result, largely speaking, operating and capital event distributions are treated the same in a European waterfall. A few other distinctions. As a result of what I previously said, an American waterfall is more sponsor-friendly or GP-friendly, whereas a European waterfall is tended to be thought as more limited partner-friendly. Of course, in most European waterfalls, cash flows between the two partners are treated largely the same. So a sponsor and an LP might both get a pro rata share of distributions, pari passu, or in the same at the same time, but a promote is not paid until the capital is returned to the LP and the sponsor, and as a result, it's generally thought of as more LP friendly. And another thing to keep in mind on an American waterfall, because the sponsor is receiving a disproportionate share of the cash flows before the LP has received a full return of capital, oftentimes you'll run into LP clawback provisions, where even if the sponsor received a promote during the operation, if there's insufficient cash flow to get the LP to both return of capital and a preferred return, the LP may have the right to claw back some of that promote paid to the sponsor during the operating period. And that, again, is a common provision to protect the LP in what is generally a sponsor-friendly structure in the American waterfall. On the European waterfall side, they're just simpler to calculate. And so my first Watch Me Build video was a European waterfall because they're simpler to calculate or simpler to model. And that's not always the case, but generally speaking, I find the European waterfall easier than the American waterfall to model. Now, finally, why European versus American? Now, I've seen people say, well, that's because the European style is more common in Europe and the American style is more common in North America. That hasn't been my experience in my conversation. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Perhaps at some time it was, but I find European and American waterfalls to be both common in the United States, and I would venture to say across the pond, the reverse also being true, that American waterfalls are seen and common in other parts of the world as much as they are, or as much as the European waterfall is. So with that being said, 4 minutes into the video, let's start the Watch Me Build. So what I have up here, as I mentioned, is a pre-built template. So what I did, just to save time, is I went in and I created my sections of the waterfall. I added labels, and then many of the cells I pre-formatted just to speed this process along. Now I'm going to walk you through the sections so you can understand how the American waterfall is set up. And so first I have ownership share assumptions. This is really getting down to what percentage is contributed by the LP versus what percentage is contributed by the GP. I then have assumptions around distributions. And you'll notice that, and this is the first difference between the American and the European, we need assumptions for our distributions during operations. We also need assumptions for our distributions at the capital event or capital events. You'll find, and in fact, I have an American Waterfall on our website that I shared, more robust than the simple one that I have here, where you can actually handle multiple capital events, maybe a mid-hold refi or an asset that has sales over a period of time, say a portfolio or a condo or a single-family residential development, etc. The other thing you'll note here is I have one tier during operation, and that's common, right? Occasionally you'll see multiple tiers during operation, but in my experience, most common is to see just one tier above a pref during operations, and then possibly multiple tiers at the capital event. And in this case here, I'm assuming during operation cash-on-cash hurdles. And this has to be the case, right? If you had IRR hurdles during operation, you'd need a return of capital in order to hit an IRR hurdle. At distribution, I'm assuming IRR hurdles. Then I have a section here where I'll summarize the partnership cash flows, both to the LP and to the GP, and I'll quickly calculate IRR for each so you can see kind of the difference between the two partners because of the promote. I then have a section where I bring in the property level net levered cash flow. And again, that would be calculated in your property level DCF. And if you're an accelerator member, you're familiar with this nomenclature: investment cash flows, operating cash flows, reversion cash flows. Those are the three sections that make up the real estate DCF. So I'm going to bring over those three. Investment cash flow just being, call it the outflows of the investment, either the acquisition cash flows or your development cash flows, whatever you're spending in order to acquire your operating and your reversion cash flows. Operating cash flows being cash flow after financing, or it's whatever cash flows are available at the operation stage that are distributable to the partners. Reversion cash flow being, again, cash flows available to distribute to the partners at a capital event. A capital event being a sale or a refinance. The sum of those cash flows get us to a net levered cash flow line. And this line is important because it's based on this line that we calculate a property level internal rate of return, or other property level metrics as well, such as equity multiple, property level levered net profit, etc. So those are our assumptions and our summary of cash flows. Then below we get into the actual waterfall, okay? And I've broken this into two sections. We've got the distributions during operations. That's our waterfall that handles our distributions from operating cash flow. And then the next section is distributions at capital event. And again, handling the distributions of cash flow that come from a capital event. Now, the quirk for distributions at capital event is because these are our IRR hurdles, we have to take into account any cash flow that's been distributed to either the LP or the GP during operations in calculating our IRR hurdles at a capital event. So you'll see how I do that. So with all that said, let's get started with the model. The first thing is our ownership share. These are just assumptions here. So I'm going to assume 90% is the limited partner's contribution share. We'll assume that the GP's is 1 minus that 90%. The sum, hitting an alt equals sign, is the sum or total of the percentage. The amount itself will be determined in a moment. And assuming we have these assumptions right and our formula is correct down below, the amount will sum to an amount that is 90% of the total. Then we get into assumptions for distribution during operations, and we really have four assumptions. The first is what hurdle rate or what preferred return does the partnership agreement call for? And so out here, I'm just going to make a quick note and say this is a cash-on-cash hurdle. When I say cash on cash, it's not a time value of money feature. It is not compounding and does not require a return of capital in order to hit that hurdle. Let's also say that the pref accrues. Okay, so any unpaid preferred return will accrue to some capital account balance that must be repaid at the capital event. And then finally, the pref is paid on the initial contribution, not on the capital account balance. So even though the pref accrues, the pref paid during operation is solely on the contributions made by the partners, not on any accrued pref, right? So that is our preferred return. What is the hurdle? We'll say it's 6%. The next assumption we have is promote. Okay, so a promote is a proportion of distributable cash flow that is paid to one of the parties above their pro rata share. Okay, and I'll talk through how that's calculated, but of course, at the preferred return level, there's no promote. Above that, let's say that there's a 15% promote being paid to the GP. Okay, and that's obvious, but we'll say paid to GP. Next, we have the distribution percentage to each of the partners. And this is incredibly important to our calculations below. And we will assume that any distributions are pro rata based on ownership percentage. Okay, so that means that at the preferred return level, the LP's distribution percentage is equal to its ownership percentage, and the GP is equal to 1 minus that 90%. And not surprisingly, it's also equal to the GP's ownership share. Now, how do we calculate the promote paid to the GP? Well, in this case, we're going to assume that the promote is paid by the partnership. Okay, when a promote is paid by the partnership, what that means is if there is $1 that's available to distribute at this tier, in this case 15%, 15 cents of that dollar, and then that dollar, by the way, is owned by the partnership, right? So 15 cents of that dollar is paid by the partnership to the GP. And so what is remaining? There's remaining 85 cents, and the GP owns 10% of that 85 cents. So the GP would receive 15 cents plus 10% of the remaining 85 cents. So how do we calculate that? Well, we go equals GP's 15% plus what? Well, 1 minus 15% is whatever's remaining, multiplied by the GP's ownership share, 10%. And the LP equals 1 minus whatever the GP receives. So where a 15% promote is paid out to the GP's distribution percentage is 22.5. LP receives 76.5. So those are our distribution assumptions during operations. Now at the capital event, we have a hurdle return of capital and unpaid pref. All right, so the idea here is now at this hurdle, there's going to be a return of capital, and we need to ensure that any unpaid pref, remember the pref accrues, is paid. And the result of that, because the pref is accruing, the result of that is the LP should hit a 6% IRR hurdle, okay? And that's what we'll be solving for, is that 6% IRR hurdle. There's no promote, of course, at this stage. And then here, what we're going to do is use this formula, just like so. And let me hit F4 on the GP's ownership percentage. I can just borrow this formula, come down, and copy it to those three. And you'll note, because the promote is 0, the GP earns simply its pro rata share. Okay. However, if we say, let's go a 15% promote in this second tier, and let's assume a 12% hurdle. So from a 6 to a 12 IRR, the GP will receive a 15% promote, which results in a 23.5% distribution percentage to the GP in the second hurdle. And then let's say above this, we'll go to a 45. So above a 12, there's a 45% promote. That's a healthy promote paid to the GP, or a distribution percentage equal to 50.5% for the GP. Well, what's the LP share? Well, it's 1 minus the GP's. We can copy that down like so, and this is now the LP's distribution percentage in each tier. So we have all of the assumptions for contributions and distributions. Let's pass over for a moment the summary of cash flows because we need to model those below. And we'll move to the property level net levered cash flow. So these are values that, again, come from a property level DCF. You'll see that I already pre-formatted those as blue font cells. That tells us those are inputs, or they're linked to values that come from a different worksheet, in which case we turn them green. But for these purposes, I'm calling them blue, so you can use this worksheet on your own. And then, so let's drop in investment cash flows. So there's a couple options. We can make these investment cash flows negative, which they are. They're outflows, right? Or we can make them positive. Here, I'm going to make them positive just to avoid confusion. So let's say there's a $5 million acquisition in time 0, and there's no additional investment cash flows going forward. So this is a simple acquisition. We pay $5 million in time 0. And then we earn $250,000 of equity cash flow from operation. We call that cash flow after financing. And then let's just imagine that grows by, I don't know, 2.5% a year over a 10-year hold period. Okay, so each year, the amount of cash flow available to distribute to the partners from operation is growing over time. And then in year 10, we have a reversion cash flow. And so this is, okay, we sell the property at, let's say, $40 million. We have a $20 million outstanding loan balance, and we're left with $20 million of equity cash flow, or cash flow available to distribute to the partners at this capital event. And then the sum of this, or this is our net levered cash flow line, we actually go equals negative investment cash flow, that's an outflow, plus an operating cash flow, plus a reversion cash flow, and then we can copy this out to the right. Now what I'll do here is I'm going to hold down Shift, right arrow out here to the end of this range, and I can either do a copy paste, or I can just hit Control R. And what Control R does is it takes the value on the far left hand of this range and it fills the entire range with that value or any formula that is in this cell. Now note that it also brings over any formatting. So if you already have formatting out here to the right that you don't want changed, the alternative is you hit Control C, again select all those cells, and then do Alt HVF, and that will just simply copy out the formulas. In this case, it made sense to fill because the formatting in this row is identical across this range. So now we have our property net levered cash flow, all of our assumptions in place. We're 18 minutes into this video. We can finally begin the waterfall. So the first row that I like to have in my waterfall is cash flow available for distribution. Now, again, this is during operation. And so what cash flow is available for distribution? It's simply our operating cash flow. All right, so I link that cell to this cell. Then I have an LP starting balance, and this is a hard-coded value. The LP's starting balance always, or almost always, I can't think of a case where it's not, always 0 at the beginning of time 0, okay? Then we have some LP contribution. And what is the LP's contribution? Well, it is equal to the investment cash flow multiplied by the LP's contribution percentage, or their ownership share. And we hit F4 on that cell D5, and that's $4.5 million. We then have an LP required return. Now, if you recall, the required return, that's the preferred return at the or during operation, is a 6% cash on cash hurdle. And it's based on initial contributions. Okay. And when I say initial contributions, what we're saying is actual contributions to cover investment cash flows or even operating shortfall, but it does not include any accrued preferred return that accrues to the partner's capital account balance. And so how we calculate this is we go equal, and we're going to sum up all contributions as of the beginning of this period. And to do that, we actually take the sum of all values starting at the previous cell, in this case E39, through to the oops, hit F2 again, the month or the year, the period exactly before the current period we're in. So in this case, I go sum E39 through E39, and then I lock in the very first half of this range, go F4 1, 2, 3 times. And what that does is that simply locks in the column but leaves the row relative, and I can then borrow this formula and use it below if I want. So I take the sum of all of that, and then I multiply that by what? By the hurdle, in this case 6%. Hit F4 on that 6%, enter. And of course it's 0 because we don't have any contribution as of the beginning of this period. And then distribution. What is the, or what should the LP receive in distributions in each period? Well, it's going to equal the minimum of the required return, right? So the LP should receive no more than the required return, or any cash flow available for distribution multiplied by the LP's contribution percent or distribution percentage in this tier. I hit F4 on that, hit enter. And then our ending balance is what? Well, it's equal to our starting balance plus any LP contribution plus the required return minus any distribution made in that period. Now I can take all of these cells, I highlight them again, holding down Shift, create this large range, and then I'll do that Control R again. And that just pulls all of those values out to the right. Now there's one thing I noticed. If you recall, we set the LP starting balance as 0 here. And so I need to go to year 1 and make this equal to the ending balance of the previous period. Now let's do the same with that range. And we've completed the first tier or the preferred return tier for the LP during operation. And what you see here is early on, there is insufficient cash flow available for distribution to cover the preferred return. And so the distribution amount is roughly $45,000 less than the required return. That amount gets added to the LP's ending balance such that the LP's capital account balance grows over the hold period. At some point, and it's right here in year 9, there's sufficient cash flow to actually cover the preferred return. And so we'll see some cash flow come down and be paid out as a promote to the GP. So let's now do the GP contribution. Well, the GP's contribution is equal to what? Well, the total investment cash flow minus the LP's contribution, or whatever's left over. That also happens to equal 10% of the total amount. And then the distribution, what should the GP be distributed? Well, if you recall, the hurdle is based on the LP's return. Okay, so now both partners receive a pro rata share, so we could do a full waterfall calculation or required return calculation for the GP like we did with the LP, but there's a shortcut here, and the shortcut is like so. We go equal, and we look at the LP's distribution, okay? And all we have to do is take the LP's distribution and divide it by the amount that was, or the distribution percentage of the LP, and hit F4 on that. And that basically grosses up the cash flow to the total amount that should be distributed to the two partners in this first tier during operation. And then I multiply that amount by the GP's distribution percentage, hit F4 on that cell. And now when I copy these out or fill these out to the right, Control R, what you'll see is GP receives or contributes 500,000 in time 0, and then receives what is basically a preferred return, or it is a preferred return. This is the GP's preferred return equivalent, and it happens to be 10% of the total amount available, or 10% of the total amount distributed in this preferred return tier. Now, then we come down, how much cash flow is remaining? Well, we go equal the cash flow available for distribution minus the amount distributed to the LP minus the amount distributed to the GP fill that out to the right, and what you'll see is there is cash flow available to distribute in these last two periods. So then we come to the promote. The LP's distribution percentage in the second tier is equal to the cash flow remaining multiplied by the LP's distribution percentage in that promote tier during operation. Hit F4 on that. And the GP's is equal to, again, any cash flow remaining multiplied by the GP's distribution percentage in that tier. F4 on that. And then we can fill that out to the right. And what we should find now is that 100% of this cash flow has been distributed between these two tiers. And we can just do a quick check of that. So this is the total amount that should have been distributed, 2.8 million. And the amount that was distributed is equal to what? Well, the sum of the LP's distribution, the GP's distribution in the first tier, and then the distribution to the two partners in the second tier, or 2.8 million. So air checked correct. We've finished with our waterfall during operation. Now let's move to the more complex half of this, the waterfall at capital event. Now some of this is similar. We start here, cash flow available for distribution. Well, what's available at a capital event? Well, whatever the cash flow is from our reversion cash flow. So we link to that row 32. Next we have, what's our starting balance? 0. What's the LP's contribution? Well, we can just link to the contribution up here, this row 39, because that's the same. Then what is the LP's required return? And this is where we begin to differ. Well, the LP's required return is equal to the starting balance multiplied by the hurdle in this tier, right? That's at 6%. Hit F4, enter. Now, what are the LP's past distributions? And this is important so that we can account for any cash flow that's already been distributed to either the LP or the GP during operation in calculating this 6% IRR hurdle. So we go equal, and this is LP distributions. LP distribution during the first tier during operation plus the LP distribution in the second tier during operation. And that's our LP past distributions. And then how much should be distributed to the LP? Well, again, we go equals minimum. So no more than however much is available for distribution multiplied by the LP's distribution percentage in this tier. Hit F4 on that. Or, so it's the minimum of that, or the starting balance in this period, plus any contributions made in this period, plus any required return in this period, minus any past distributions. So what we're basically saying, and this is how we get to an IRR hurdle, is we're either going to sweep all cash flow that's available for this distribution at the LP's distribution percentage rate, or take the entire starting balance at this period plus any contributions and required return, but minus any past distributions. That's going to be how much we're going to take the minimum of those two, and in doing so, that will get us to a 6% IRR. Then we have an ending balance. What's the ending balance? Well, it's equal to the starting balance plus any contributions plus any required return minus any past distributions minus any actual distributions in this tier. That's our ending balance. And our IRR air check is equal to, and this is our cash flow, our net levered cash flow, or net cash flow line for the LP here. So it's equal negative contribution plus distribution past and distribution present. And we can take all of these, fill out to the right, and then we just need to complete our starting balance. So come to period 1, make it equal to the ending balance of the previous period, fill this out to the right, And if we've done this correctly, we can run an IRR equals IRR of that range, and it will be equal to 6%. So we've done that correctly. Or basically what happened is here at this capital event, there is $4.77 million that was needed in order to return capital, $4.5 million, and cover the remaining unpaid preferred return, which was the difference between $4.777 million and $4.5 million. Now let's do the GP's cash flow in this tier. So contributions, again, equal to the GP's contribution line there. Past distributions equal distributions in the first and second tier during operation. And then how much is the GP distributed in this tier? Well, we can use that same shortcut. We take the LP's distribution in this tier, we gross it up, or we divide it by the LP's distribution percentage in this tier, and then we multiply that by the GP's distribution percentage in this tier, F4. And then the GP IRR calc. Now, I don't call this an error check like I do here, and the reason why is we are not solving for a GP IRR. In most cases, well, in cases where the GP and LP are distributed a pro rata share in the first tier, then their IRR will be the same. But that isn't always the case, and so I'm not calling this an error check, but simply a GP IRR calc. Let's calculate the GP's cash flow, negative contribution plus past and present distributions. Fill all those ranges, control all R out to the right, and then let's run an IRR, and we find that it also is 6%. Not a surprise. So then we have cash flow remaining, and this is important because whatever's remaining here will flow into our subsequent tiers. We simply go, all right, how much cash flow is available for distribution at the capital event, and we subtract out the LP distribution in this tier and the GP distribution in this tier. Fill that out to the right. And what we find is there is almost $15 million remaining to flow into our subsequent tiers. So let's move to tier 2. Cash flow available for distribution happens to be the cash flow remaining from that line. LP starting balance is 0. LP contribution equal to the contribution right up here. LP required return, and this is that same formula, equals the starting balance multiplied by the hurdle in this tier, F4 on that, hit enter. The past distributions are what? Well, we can simply come and grab the LP past distributions from the previous tier plus the LP distribution from the previous tier, and that's going to be our past distributions. So that's both distributions during operation as well as distributions from the first tier during the capital event distribution. And then LP distribution in this tier, again, same formula as we used below, or above. We go, what's the cash flow available for distribution multiplied by, oops, what am I doing here? I'm going to go min. I'm going to take the minimum of cash flow available for distribution multiplied by the LP's distribution percentage in this tier, F4. It's the minimum of that. Or, pull this down, the LP starting balance plus LP contribution plus required return minus any distributions already made in this tier. Ending balance equals starting balance plus contribution plus required return minus past distributions and present distributions. And we can do our LP cash flow in this tier equals negative contribution plus past and present distributions. Fill this out to the right. Complete our starting balance equals ending balance of the previous period. And if we did this correctly, cross our fingers, it should be a 12. And it is, okay? We have distributed, or will need to distribute, $4.876 million in addition to what was already distributed in the first tier in order to hit now a 12% IRR for the LP. The GP, though, cash flows are modeled almost identical. In fact, we'll come up here. Let's grab those rows, hit a Control C, come down, and on over these rows, hit a Control V, and let's see how close we are. Okay, the contributions line is off, so GP contributions are equal to that line. Copy that out to the right. Past distributions are equal to the past distribution there, those two. Fill that out to the right. And then the GP distributions here is going to take the LP distribution, gross that up. Okay, that line is done and this line is done. You'll see the IRR is not the same, and that's because we now come to here. This is not right. Yeah. So it's pulling the distribution percentage from the first tier. We need to pull from the second tier. As soon as we pull from the second tier, it will distribute a disproportionate amount to the GP, and you'll notice now the GP's IRR is higher, and that's to be expected because the GP is receiving a disproportionate share of the cash flow. So until the LP hits a 12, a disproportionate share is going to the GP, which results in a higher IRR for the GP. Now, there's some cash flow remaining. What is it? Well, it's the cash flow available for distribution in this tier minus distributions made to the LP and the GP in this tier. Pull it out to the right, and you'll see there is 8.316 million remaining, and the last tier is the easiest. Well, what is it? It's equal to, for the LP, any cash flow remaining multiplied by the LP's distribution percentage in this tier, 49.5%. Hit F4 on that cell, and then also for the GP, cash flow remaining multiplied by the GP's share in this tier, 50.5. Hit F4 on that. Fill those out to the right. And we've distributed roughly 50-50. It's actually 49.5, 50.5 to the LP, GP. The sum of those two equals 8.316 million. Now, let's come up and do an air check. Actually, before we do the air check, let's calculate, or let's drop in the LP and the GP's cash flows in a summary, and then we'll calculate the actual IRR for the LP and the GP. So the contributions for the LP equal to, we can just grab those from this line 39. The distributions, and let's just grab the distributions in each of their tiers. So we take LP distribution in the first tier during operation plus LP distribution in the second tier during operation plus LP distribution in the first tier at capital event plus LP distribution in the second tier during or at capital event plus the LP distribution third tier capital event. Okay. And then we can do the IRR line or the LP's net cash flow line, negative contribution plus distributions. Fill these all the way out to the right. And then if we run an IRR here, 15.40%. Let's come and run. So I'm going to copy this formula down. I'm going to run it on this property level line. And what you'll see is because the GP receives a disproportionate share of the distributions, the LP's IRR will always be below the property level IRR, so long as the GP hits any of the promote hurdles. Let's do the GP's cash flow. Contribution equals row 44. Distributions, again, let's hit it one by one. The GP distribution, tier 1 during operation, plus tier 2 during operation, plus tier 1 at capital event, plus tier 2 at capital event, plus tier 3 at capital event. Hit enter. And then we'll do the GP's net cash flow line is minus contribution plus distribution. Fill all these out to the right. And then run our IRR here. And of course, it is above the property level IRR, as you'd expect, because the GP receives a disproportionate share of the cash flows. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and run an IRR or a air check. So we want to ensure that all cash flows have been properly contributed from and distributed to the partners. So first we go equals, and let's just sum up the net cash flow available at the property level. So that's just net levered cash flow line. And so that's the sum of both distributions and contributions, or requirements for contributions and cash flow available to distribute at the property level. We sum that. Then we take the sum of our LP net cash flow line and our GP net cash flow line. And if we've modeled this correctly, those values should be the same. They are. And so then we'll just write some quick logic here that says equals if cell M5 equals cell M6, then let's return okay, otherwise let's return error. And this is important because what you'll find is, okay, we've modeled this in one way. We've assumed certain things as we've gone, and you might use this as a template. You'll create your own, right? And so you build a model, you might use it as a template down the road, and you might run into a scenario that you hadn't accounted for in any of your logic, and this air check will help you identify that. In fact, on my American style waterfall that I shared to the ACRE library, just recently, we're in version 1.3 on that model, which means we've gone through probably 6 iterations over the years. And someone noticed that when you had multiple investment cash flows across periods and multiple capital events, that it wasn't modeling that correctly. And this individual found an error, emailed us. I fixed the error, found where it was, and it basically was I hadn't been accounting for some of the past distributions in years where there is a capital event mid-hold. So anyway, that's why this air check is important. So this is an American style waterfall. Let me make some final notes here. A couple things. The first here, the net levered cash flow at the property level is gross, meaning it's before GP fees. It adds an additional level of complexity to model in GP fees. Another one is, say, this required return here. This is based, as I said, on the initial capital contribution only. Okay, so it's not based on capital account. Let's see, what are some other ones? Okay, yeah, this is actually based on capital account balance, right? This IRR calculation. And then, okay, this is an important one. There's no catch up here. Actually, better put, there's no clawback feature. And what does that mean? Well, it means that if you notice, during operation, the GP received a disproportionate share in the last 2 periods. Imagine a scenario where there was insufficient cash flow to return capital to the LP. The GP still would have received more than it was actually due. And so to account for that, you'd want to model in a clawback. The other thing we don't have here is we don't have a GP catch-up. Now, in this case, it's not necessary because we are distributing pro rata based on ownership share. But you might have a scenario where, let's say that it's not pro rata. It's to the LP first. LP receives, even though it's 90-10, LP receives 100% of the cash flow in this preferred return tier, and or even worse, 100% of the cash flow here. That would make this 0. And in that case, the GP most likely will negotiate a catch-up where once the LP hits 100%, or once the LP receives a return of capital and a preferred return, then the GP would receive 100% of the cash flow until it catches up to either an IRR hurdle or to a profit share amount, etc. So that wasn't included in this model either. But with all that said, that is an American-style real estate equity waterfall model. It took us, less than 45 minutes. Let me know if you have any questions on this one. It was a fun one. Otherwise, thanks for your time.